The meeting of the West Coast chapter, really the Los Angeles chapter of the International Marxist Humanist Organization. As a lot of you know, we hold monthly meetings, and we've been holding a meeting on Peter Hudis's recent book, Marx's Concept of the Alternative to Capitalism. And we're very happy tonight to welcome Peter Hudis, the author, who's coming in from Chicago. In addition to having written this book, Peter is the author of numerous articles on just about every topic you could imagine of interest to the left, from a book he's working on right now on Frantz Fanon, the African liberation theorist, to articles on Marxism and ecology, dialectics, just you name it. But probably the other thing he's best known for in recent years is he's general editor of the complete works of Rosa Luxemburg, the very important Marxist and feminist who was a contemporary of Lenin and Trotsky. And the volume he edited a few years ago of the Letters of Luxemburg, with several other people, it got reviewed by major daily newspapers all over the English-speaking world, except the United States, of course. But it did get reviewed by The Nation, New Republic, and a lot of fairly prominent places, nonetheless. And he's also, I worked with him as co-editor of The Power of Negativity, selected writings of Raya Dunayevskaya on Hegel, Marx, and the Dialectic, and then also on the Rosa Luxemburg Reader. We have a lot of books and pamphlets which are available during the break that people can look at, and where they're going at much lower prices tonight than usual in honor of Peter's visit. So this, as I mentioned, we've been having several meetings over the past few months on Peter's book, and then tonight is we'll get to hear directly from Peter. We're also and we're having a second shorter presentation by Sarah Mason, longtime LA activist, at least since the period of Occupy LA, when she was one of the most active people, and who's been involved in many, many other types of movement activities since then. And she'll be following Peter's presentation, and then after that we'll take a break, and then we'll reconvene for open discussion. So, Peter.
Well, thank you. Well, it's great to be here, and I look forward to getting to know you all better through the meeting and the discussion and afterwards, because this is really more in the spirit, not of so much of a lecture as I see it, but of a dialogue, because I think there are a few problems that are more pressing for anybody who's interested in liberation today than the fact that there's a very heavy ideological cloud weighing on all of us, everybody who's aspiring for any kind of social change in the world, and that is the presupposition that there is no fundamental alternative to capitalism, that capitalism in one form or another is here to stay. This is the primary ideological notion that prevails today, and it's a very difficult notion to break through for a number of reasons. Now, I think we're all familiar with the manifestations of this problem. Whether it be the fact that it seems that actually existing capitalism that we have in the world seems to be promising us not much more than endless austerity. The fact that all areas of human life are being commodified as never before, and those few areas of the life world that have not been subjected to commodification, they're being subjected to monetary relations, that have not been subjected so far to capital, are rapidly disappearing, such like public spaces, public sphere, education, ecology, the environment. Capitalism is invading everything and distorting even the most fundamental, intimate human relationships. We can even say that capital, by its very nature, in a certain sense, tries to squeeze out intimacy from human relationships and instead inject a kind of abstract form of domination. We are connected to each other primarily through an abstraction, exchange value, the value of a commodity as measured in money. And this is becoming a bigger and bigger issue all over the world, and it has a lot to do with the this ideological cloud, as I call it, this notion that there is no alternative to capitalism. Well, whether we are around in this room, if you have just come around the radical movement recently, or whether you've been in the radical movement for many years, I think all of us will ultimately be judged by how successful we will prove to be. I mean, not just those of us in this room, obviously, but this generation of activists and thinkers in dispelling this ideological cloud and being able to project a viable vision of a post-capitalist society. Because if we can't do that, even when creative struggles emerge, they lack a sense of direction as to their ultimate purpose and goal, and they fall short. One of the reasons it is hard to articulate an alternative to capitalism, frankly, we always have to admit this, it's kind of the elephant in the room, sometimes doesn't get mentioned, is that there have been many efforts, of course, to create an alternative to capitalism in the 20th century, in the past 100 years, and frankly, they have all failed. Certainly the state command economies of the Soviet Union or so-called communist China, etc., did not deliver humanity from the ravages of capitalism. They ended up evolving into yet one more version of capitalism. I would argue they were a version of capitalism from the beginning, state capitalism, and then evolving into a more closer variant towards free market capitalism, perhaps mixed with still some state component like China itself. And the fact that we've had these disappointments in the effort to transcend capitalism, or roadblocks in the effort to transcend capitalism, roadblocks from within the radical movement, makes the ideological cloud of there is no alternative to capitalism all the more overwhelming. I just want to tell one story that I think might focus this a little bit. In Chicago a few months ago, I helped to bring very important indigenous rights activists from Bolivia on a tour of the Midwest, Felix Murucci, whose his autobiography has been published in English, From the Mines to the Streets. He's somebody who was one of the foremost activists in the Aymara consciousness movement of Bolivia and the water wars in Cochabamba in 2000, and many other struggles for social justice in Bolivia. And he gave a very moving presentation about the social changes in Bolivia since Evo Morales has been elected president, and other mass movements that have very creatively arisen in Bolivia. But when the discussion came up, he also made it very clear that the left movements, especially the radical indigenous rights movements in Bolivia, are very disappointed now with Evo Morales. And he called him a left-wing neoliberal in his presentation, that he's making too many compromises with global capital. And so I asked the question in the discussion, well, but why is there a left-wing opposition to his move towards the center or the right, or his disappointments? And what does it look like? Is there an anti-capitalist alternative that's developing and growing in Bolivia? And he says, well, it's hard to answer because we used to know what socialism was 20 years ago, he said. And then, now, we don't know what it means. We used to think it was state planning of the economy, you just nationalize property, you get socialism. You eliminate private property, have a controlled market, end the free market, have a organized market through the state plan. But he says now we know that that's not really true socialism, but we really don't have a sense of what true socialism is. So he says we're kind of like groping in the dark a bit. And I think that when he said that, that wasn't about Bolivia. That, I think, could have been said about 100 different struggles around the world today, including our own right here. So that's why I wrote this book, frankly, was as a modest effort to try to say, what new theoretical resources can we draw upon to try to envision a viable alternative to capitalism that does not repeat the failures of the past? Now, it might sound strange for me to say new, because the person I'm going to is Marx, who's not new. He's been dead a few years, more than a few. So why do we begin there? Why do I begin there? Well, it's not self-evident why you would begin there, because the standard view throughout the radical movement, since even when Marx was alive, was, well, Marx had great things to say in terms of being a critic of capitalism, but he really didn't say much about the alternative to capitalism. After all, he never wrote a book called Socialism. He wrote a book called Capital. By the way, he never wrote a book called Capitalism. He wrote a book called Capital. Because what Marx was interested in, I'm going to talk some about this, was he was interested in unraveling the fundamental thing that drives capitalism, that makes it such a perverse and inhumane system, which is the social relation called capital, which takes on a life of its own and dominates. No question that Marx was a great critic of existing capitalist society by delineating and critiquing the logic of capital, the fundamental dominating power of modern society. But people concluded from this that since he had apparently so little to say about a future society, and Marx was clearly against utopian speculation about the future, that therefore he didn't really write about this at all. But I couldn't buy that as a Marxist humanist, frankly. And for a number of years, those of us in the International Marxist Humanist Organization has been having this discussion about how could Marx develop such a profound critique of capitalism if he didn't know what the alternative to it would be. I mean, what would he have it to compare it to? You can't see what's wrong with something that exists in the depth Marx was able to do unless you have some sort of vision or idea in your head of what the alternative to a world based on wage labor, class society, exploitation, sexism, racism, etc. would look like. So even if he never wrote a book on this subject, even if he never wrote a single article on this subject, I said, it might be worthwhile to look at his work anew to see if we can find within Marx's work, which everybody would agree is the archetypical, most powerful, profound critique of capital, is there at least an implicit, if not explicit, vision of an alternative way of organizing society that the radical movement has unfortunately not paid attention to, especially since his death. That's why I wrote this book, to try to take up that question. Now, obviously, I'm not claiming, and none of us in the IMHO claim that Marx had the answer all worked out, and we just have to repeat what Marx said. If that was as easy as it was, that would not be creative thinking. Rather, what the argument I want to make here and briefly summarize some main points that hopefully picking up on some of the discussions you've been having here in Los Angeles is what are some of the fundamental points that Marx looked at in his critique of capital that can illuminate the alternative to capital in a new way for us in the 21st century. Now, the first thing that I want to emphasize is that when you read Marx's work seriously, I think it's pretty clear that Marx had a very specific object of critique. That is, he had a specific target of criticism as what was the fundamental problem with capitalism. Now, there's a lot of problems with capitalism, of course. I mean, we can make a list of, I mean, we can just start off with a 100 list. I mean, I could, at least. I'm sure those of you could too. But the fundamental object of Marx's critique was not the existence of private property, although he was against that, for sure, and was not even the existence of an anarchic free market, although he was against that too. Marx's critique of capitalism goes deeper, and it's a critique of capital. That is, when capital becomes the all-dominating power of society, the medium of our social existence. All social relations get washed through this social relation called capital. So what is capital? Capital is fundamentally a product of a certain type of labor. Now, it's not the product of any kind, just any kind of labor, because labor's existed through all of human history, and there's been embodiments or crystallizations of laboring activity in products that people produce. But you wouldn't say that if you're like an artist completely separated from the market for a second, not all artists are, when you creatively create something through your own freely associated activity and you embody your laboring energy and your mind and your muscle into an object, you wouldn't call that capital, because it doesn't take on a life of its own and exploit and dominate you, okay? Capital is a product of a certain type of labor that takes on a life of its own, according to Marx, and it becomes a person apart from us. We, the producer, end up becoming controlled by our own product. And the reason we do so is we are not in control of the very process of creating that product. That is, according to Marx, we're not simply alienated from the product of our labor. That is, every worker produces much more value than they receive back from their boss in wages and benefits. Rather, the reason that problem exists, according to Marx, is that workers are alienated from their very activity of making the product to begin with. In other words, they're not in control of their own laboring activity. They're suffering from alienated, or what he calls abstract, undifferentiated labor. So it's because of that that capital takes on a life of its own and becomes what he calls self-expanding value. That is, capital is a expression of wealth computed in monetary terms. Now, this is you may well have covered this in your discussions so far, but for those of you who may not have been at some of them, it's a terminology issue that we have to make clear from the beginning. You know, English is a funny language. It's not my favorite one. We have two completely different ways of referring to the word value in English. Now, one is like, say, I value your smile, I value my friendship with you, okay? That's a very different meaning of the word value when I ask, okay, what's the value of your bank account? Or what's the value of your car? Or what's the value of your home mortgage, right? The first is just a generic, sense of how much something is worth in a human sense. I value your friendship, I value your smile. The second, when I say, what's the value of this commodity, what I'm talking about is wealth computed in monetary terms. And that is the kind that, according to Marx, in capitalism, this type of value becomes overwhelming. Everything gets judged based on how valuable it is based on an abstract number that's attached to it, irrespective of your needs, nature's needs, or our community's needs. So when Marx defines capital as self-expanding value, he means that it is an expression of an alienated type of laboring activity in which the laborer themselves feels abstract or undifferentiated in their own activity. You fall into a kind of monotonous, routinized form of activity at work in which you're no longer in control of or in touch with or at home in your own activity of producing that product. The activity itself becomes abstract. Have you ever felt that at work, right? Like you're doing it, but it's not really you, huh? Okay? And capital is the congealment or expression of this sort of alienated relationship. So that's really what Marx is doing in his work, is critiquing this, what he considers a very perverse reduction of human values into purely value as an expression of wealth computed in monetary terms that everything now gets washed into. Now, there's two ways, I think, the two areas in which we can look at, even if we just restrict ourselves to what Marx critiqued. Because there are places in Marx, and I'm going to try to show that I can't do it in one talk. You read my book, I have a lot more examples. I'm going to give one example here later on at the end of my talk. But there are a lot of places where Marx actually does talk about what the new society should look like. What would be a kind of capitalism that's neither state capitalism nor market capitalism? And that's the greatness of reading Marx. You can find the theoretical resources to think out this problem for today. But even before you get to that, a negative criticism can sometimes reveal a positive. Marx followed that old dictum of Spinoza, the great Dutch philosopher, Portuguese Jewish philosopher who lived in the Netherlands. All determination is negation. You know what something is by knowing what it is not. You know what a post-capitalist society is if you truly understand how capital operates. That's one way we can draw out a vision of what was Marx's concept of an alternative to capitalism, even where he doesn't explicitly mention that alternative. The second place is even more interesting, though, so I'm not going to have much time to talk about, but maybe it'll come up in discussion, is that Marx, was known as a kind of cantankerous fellow. I mean in a good way. They say cantankerous people who get in a lot of arguments sometimes live longer. In other words, he had a lot of fights with fellow socialists and communists in his lifetime. He didn't seem to like any of them, when you really look at his work. He had something critical to say about even his closest followers, even Engels, okay? I can give you examples of that. Why was he so critical of some of his closest followers, who were very dedicated socialists and communists? Because when you look carefully at his criticisms of his, so to speak, co-thinkers or his own followers, he said their vision of a new society wasn't deep enough. It didn't really surmount the parameters of the all-dominating power of capital. So, Marx's critique of capital, or his analysis of capital, that might illuminate for us some issues of an alternative to capitalism that we can work out for the 21st century. We were the ones who have to work it out. It's not all done. It's not all in Marx's work, but there's hints and suggestions that we can collectively work out. Because one thing I want to make clear about the IMHO, our organization, we don't think theory should be done just by academics. We think theory should be done by those involved in a movement for freedom. And everybody can be a theoretician and should be a theoretician. That's what a movement should be, is a body of thinkers who are activists at the same time. Okay, 3 points of Marx's critique of capital that might relate to the question of the future. The first thing, which I think a lot of you are probably aware of, is that Marx argues that since capital is self-expanding value, it's value that grows big with value, the pursuit of profit in capitalism becomes an end in itself. No corporation tries to make a profit as a means towards something else. Or I can put it more simply, GM doesn't produce cars in order to sell cars. Colgate Palmolive doesn't sell toothpaste in order to provide toothpaste. And, well, let's say, I'll just use an example from out of town so you don't get insulted. Northwestern University does not produce diplomas. Phoenix University. University of Phoenix does not issue diplomas in order to educate people. That's not what they're trying to do. What are they trying to all do? They're all trying to make money. They're trying to generate profit. The production of the particular use value that comes out of those companies is secondary to the augmentation or increase of their profit. That's the end in itself. That's the only reason any capitalist is in business, obviously. Now, something has happened since the mid-1970s, which we are still in the shadow of. Global capitalism in the mid-1970s began to realize, for various reasons I can't go into right here, that the rate of profit, which is all important for any corporation, on a global level was starting to level off and drop. That the average rates of profit for corporations, especially big ones in manufacturing, was in decline. Now, what does capitalism do when it's not getting the rate of profit that it used to get in the past, or that it wants to get in the future? Well, there's really one very simple way it responds to this, and it tries to, therefore, redistribute value from workers and other people who are the producers of value, and it tries to take away some of that value that goes to wages and benefits, and then puts it back into capital so capital can keep growing big with itself. Value big with value. In other words, austerity, cutbacks, etc., which has been going on now for 40 years continuously in one way or another. And what you end up with is a situation where you have a transfer of wealth basically from the poorer sectors of society, the value producing sectors, to capital itself. This is a transference of wealth, what we call a redistribution of income from the bottom to the top, you can call it, okay? And this is why the drive for austerity is so relentless in modern capitalism today. You know, if you read I don't recommend doing it every morning for breakfast. I do it once in a while. When I pick up the Wall Street Journal and read what their editorials say very often, some of them are actually quite honest. They say, what the American people don't realize is we have to have these austerity conditions and cutbacks and et cetera, not for the next 4 or 5 years, but for the next 4 or 5 decades. Mm-hmm. That's what your whole life is going to consist of, basically, what they're saying. So it's a transference of redistributing value from labor to capital, basically. Now, therefore, this is, of course, why we have, the 99% supporting the 1%, while I don't have to go into those details or facts about that. But it also means this, that it's a mistake to simply target the surface appearance of this problem and not get to the root of it. That is, it's very easy to say, oh, those rich bankers or that 1%, they're ripping off all of us. But actually, that's just a phenomenal expression of a deeper problem. That is, capitalism, when it runs into a decline in its profit rates, has to steal that value from labor and give it back to capital in order for capital to keep growing big with value. It has to do it regardless of the person who actually is in charge of doing it. So it's not the personifications of capital that matter as much as the logic of capital itself. When we get to understand that a lot more, we can begin to target the problem, not simply the bad people who are responsible for this system, and there's a lot of bad people out there who are responsible for them, and we shouldn't let them off the hook. I'm not saying we shouldn't let them off the hook. But in challenging them, we should look deeper into what's driving them, because they're just the expressions. They're not the cause, they're the effect. We have to target the capital relationship itself. Now, I think that gets to Marx's concept of an alternative to capitalism. Because Marx holds that you can't get rid of the domination of people by capital just by having the state own capital instead of private corporations. Marx himself had a word for that kind of people who thought that in his lifetime. He called them crude, stupid, and unthinking, vulgar communists. Now, a philosopher who makes a comment like that, I don't think is giving a compliment, okay, to people who call us crude, stupid, unthinking. These are people who thought that if the state replaces the private individual as the owner of capital, then you've got the problem fundamentally resolved. But Marx is basically saying, no, that doesn't get to the fundamental problem of the root here. So, the alternative to capitalism from Marx has to get rid of capital itself as the medium of social reproduction. It has to get rid of value production. It has to get rid of the kind of labor that is responsible for the dominance of capital to begin with, which is abstract or alienated labor. The alienation from the very activity of your creative actions, that has to be what has to be transformed. Otherwise, capital itself will just reappear in another manifestation. Second point. Marx also showed that the logic of capital is what? Because it's driven to increase profit. How do you increase profit if you're part of a corporation? Well, you do that by increasing the productivity of labor. And there's no system that's ever existed on earth that's better at this than capitalism, increasing the productivity of labor. How do you increase the productivity of labor? Because labor is a source of all value. How you increase the productivity of labor is that you get workers to produce more in a shorter amount of time. How do you get them to do that? You harness workers to technological devices and you increase the amount of technological innovation in society so that you have less relative living laborers who are producing more value in a shorter amount of time span. And by the way, this is why every technological device that comes out 6 months or a year later is out of date and you got to get another one, right? I mean, I used to love my old cell phone, the one with the razor phone, you know? People make fun of me about that. Of course, I can do everything in the world now with my iPhone, but I know in 6 months from now, everybody's going to laugh at me because I only have a 5S, okay? And they're going to say, where is your 6 or 7 or whatever else, right? Capitalism is always driven for these technological innovations because they're very helpful in boosting the productivity of labor. But what does that do? That means the trajectory of capitalism is to reduce the amount of what's called productive labor, that is, labor that produces value and surplus value, relative to the amount of capital that the worker actually generates and produces. Which means that you have a greater and greater dominance of capital over less and less relative living labor. Now, I'll just give you 2 examples of this. You know, everybody likes to talk about, well, China, all the jobs are running to China. Do you know that there are fewer industrial workers in China today than there were 35 years ago? They're producing an enormous amount of greater value and product than 35 years ago. But they're doing so with actually fewer relative workers relative to the capital volume that they're producing. And the other side of that is, it's not true that we're not producing. People always say, oh, we're not producing anything in America anymore. Not true. It's only in the last year that the value of Chinese manufacturing has outpaced the value of U.S. manufacturing. We still produce about $1.8 trillion a year worth of manufacturing in the U.S. I think China is 1.85. And only in the last year has China gone ahead of us. We're producing, we're still a massive manufacturing power. We just don't have hardly any workers doing it. Huh? So, what does this do? I'm going to quote from, what does this do when you have greater output generated by a relatively smaller number of workers? And this is going to be pushed, capitalism is pushing always in that direction to shrink that number of productive workers, smaller, to augment the productivity of labor. Now I'm going to read out something Marx said in volume 3 of Capital that relates to this. Good, basic sense. He wrote, quote, I'm not going to throw a lot of quotes. A development in the productive forces that would reduce the absolute number of workers and actually enable the whole nation to accomplish its entire production in a shorter period of time would produce a revolution, since it would put the majority of the people out of action. So the logic of this, he says, that capitalism keeps on pushing in this direction, you're going to get a revolution because you're going to end up with like 40% of the population unemployed. And by the way, that's pretty much where the world is right now. When you think about it, because half of the world just in the last year, 51% of the world, 50.1% of the world now lives in cities. Just for the first time last year, the majority of the world lives in cities, and half of the people living in cities are unemployed or marginally employed around the world. So that's a quarter of humanity right there, bingo. We're not even talking about rural unemployment and everything else. So, but capitalism doesn't like revolutions, as you probably know. That's why they have all this fancy spying stuff. So how does it try to avoid this situation when it wants to reduce the number of workers employed in creating value, increase the productivity of labor relative to the volume of the capital? And how does it do that? By avoiding revolution. Well, one way it used to do so was by increasing the employment in the economy of areas outside of industrial production, like service workers or the public sector, to soak up those formerly people who used to be in the factory, as it were, now soaking them up into the public sector to do other types of labor. And in many cases, labor that doesn't produce, from a capitalist point of view, value and surplus value, but still has some social benefit, and it keeps people off the streets from making revolution or causing trouble or whatnot. That's, teachers and, all kinds of other public employees, government employees, etc. The point, however, is today the crisis of capitalism is so deep that it's now realizing it can't afford even that. It's got to push those people out of employment. And it's got to bring the capital relationship into formerly non-capitalized sectors, like, for instance, public education. This is why the big battle a lot of people are faced with in education is basically to commodify education to the utmost, right? Turn it into standardized student tests. Teachers would be paid based upon the grades of their students on standardized tests, blah, blah, blah. It just basically turns the students into an assembly line, okay, of another sort, a knowledge assembly line. So the point here is that since capitalism is continuously driven to reduce the proportion of living labor to dead labor, over time, even the employment of non-industrial workers comes under attack by capital. And that's what we're going through now, and that's what we're going to be going through for a long time. So, what do we do about it? Well, again, for Marx, there has to be to break this kind of perverse tendency or logic of capital. You can't simply take the approach of saying, okay, we're going to have some entity come in and control capital and make it less rapacious. Capital, by its very nature, according to Marx, is an uncontrollable phenomenon. The state can't control it, public opinion can't control it, elections can't control it, great, beautiful people who have good intentions who try to control it through some sort of legislation. Eventually, it's like water running down a hill. Capital will always find its proper rate of profit, right? And it will push anything out of the way that gets in the way of that. So what you have to do is, you have to abolish capital. And the only way to abolish capital, you abolish the logic of capital by abolishing capital. The only way to abolish capital is to abolish the kind of labor that is constituted in capital. That is the kind of labor that creates capital, which is abstract or alienated labor. What does that mean, though? Well, in my book, I argue that it really centers on the question of time. Time in capitalism becomes a very weird thing. And a lot of people don't wear them anymore, but I still have a habit of wearing my watch because I don't always want to check my cell phone. And think about it for a second, how perverse this is. 500, 600 years ago, how did people tell time? They looked out the window and they said, okay, it's morning, the sun is out. And of course, in a lot of places, especially not on the equator, the days are longer in the summer, shorter in the winter. So you sleep more in the winter, you sleep less in the summer, whatever. In other words, time is variable. It's based upon human rhythm. Okay, it's more naturally connected to your sensuous, who you are as a sensuous being. But now what we do in capitalism, time becomes abstract. Time becomes quantitatively determined in these numbers, and you have to obey time. Time doesn't obey you. And the key thing here is the productive system that creates capital, the kind of labor that creates capital, is a very peculiar, it's a very peculiar concept of time is involved in this. I'll spell that out as directly as I can this way. You might think that you get paid for the work, for the amount of time you put into doing your job, but you never do. No worker is ever paid for the amount of time they put into working at their job. You are not paid based on the actual amount of time that you perform your job. You are paid based on the average of the amount of time that is socially necessary to create that product. Now, what does that mean? What that means is capitalism dictates to any worker, not directly, it's behind the back, nobody does it consciously, the capitalists don't sit in boardrooms and think this out, they have no idea that this is going on themselves, they're as blind to this as anybody else, as most other people are. Capitalism actually does what? It basically says, it's not true that labor, according to Marx, is the source of value, if you really want to get exact. Labor is not the source of value. Abstract, socially necessary labor time is a source of value. Now, the example I give in my book is as follows. Simply is that if an auto worker in let's say, if we still have one in Detroit, I think there's one auto factory left in Detroit, is assembling an automobile in 24 hours. But all the other automobiles now in the rest of the world, especially like Brazil, China, etc., they can assemble the same quality vehicle, basically the same vehicle in 16 hours. The value, the 24 hours that the worker works in Detroit versus the 16 that they work elsewhere, that 24 hours does not count as creating value. The average that is necessary on the world scale is what creates the value. So the 16 hours determines that. If you work 24 hours to do the same job, the extra 8 hours of work that the Detroit auto worker does creates, from a capitalist point of view, no value. And that is why then they come in and tell the workers in Detroit, hey, make it faster, make it in 16, not 24. Okay? And there's constant pressure to conform to the ticking of the factory clock, right? And to force down your laboring activity to this routinized abstraction. That is, as Marx puts it famously, in capitalism, we become the carcass of time. We become hollowed out by this abstract notion of time. We don't control time anymore. Time controls us, this abstract average that operates behind our backs. Now, no worker knows exactly at any given day what is the socially necessary average labor time that it takes to produce a given commodity. And frankly, no capitalist knows it either. How the capitalists discover it is simply post festum, that is after the feast in Latin, through the laws of competition. That is, a capitalist knows, oh, I'm selling this product, but it has this cost of production. This cost of production is higher because the workers are working longer hours to produce the same thing as somebody in China. Therefore, I'm getting undersold and being driven out of business by that other competitor that can sell the product cheaper because it has a lower cost of production. Therefore, I better lower my cost of production by getting the workers to obey, to lower the amount of time it takes for them to produce this commodity. So time becomes a person apart. We're not in control of our time. Now, there's some aspects in your everyday life where you get a different sense of what a non-capitalistic kind of sense of time might be, however, very radically non-capitalistic organization of time. I come to LA, I have a week off, so I can come out here. I say, well, I want to give a talk to the IMHO in LA. There's going to be so many hours. I hope to go out for a drink or something to eat afterwards, people that we continue the discussion. And yeah, tomorrow I want to see if I can hit the beach, because, in Chicago it's been the coldest winter in 40 years. I would have spent so much time doing it. I freely think out and organize my time based on my sensuous needs and desires, right? It's a freely associated reorganization of time. Capitalism doesn't allow you to do that, as you well know. Even in your leisure time, they're dictating your time. Huh? So, right there, I think, we have the pivot of the alternative to capitalism, in the sense that Marx is suggesting that we have to end this dictatorship of abstract universal labor time, this dictatorship of having to work according to an abstract average of time that we don't decide upon, and nobody decides upon it. Even the capitalists are the effect of this. It operates behind the backs of human beings. That's the most perverse thing about capitalism. Human beings create it, and yet we are the creator. We are created by it against our will. And by the way, there's just one thing that always strikes me. I'm told I'm a very irritating person to watch the news with, because I usually throw all sorts of sharp objects at the TV screen when somebody says something stupid. And I have to get out of that habit because I've broken more than one TV screen in my life. Anyhow, but have you ever noticed this thing that, the economy is doing good this week. The economy is doing bad this month. Have you ever thought that how perverse that sentence is? As if the economy is like the weather, a person apart that operates independent of human control. When in fact, what is the economy? The sum total of our own activity. But we invest this product of our own activity, and we treat it as if it's a thing apart that has a life of its own, and we are the passive recipients of it. It's like, those who create the idols. They create the idols out of wood and stone, and then they bow down before the idols, and they think that the idols actually create them, right? This inversion, Marx calls it, okay? There's a lot of parallel here. So this is really what Marx, I think, is getting at in his work on, in terms of domination of the logic of capital. Now, just one third point, I just would very briefly get to. Capital, as I mentioned, wants to reduce labor costs, right? It wants to push the amount of labor time, squeeze the amount of labor time to a minimum and extract the maximum amount of output for any given hour of labor. That's part of how you augment or grow profit and surplus value. But there's a problem here. It's a logic. You can just think it out logically, but it's also empirically you can trace it out. If you have less and less living labor, but more and more congealed capital, where do you get, if labor is the only source of value, how do you get sufficient value to reproduce the value of the congealed capital over the long run? Because you have less and less living labor, but you have more and more capital, and the value of that capital has to be reproduced at every cycle of the production process. This is where capitalism runs into kind of a treadmill effect. In order to increase productivity, it has to lower labor time, the amount of time it takes to produce something, but by squeezing down the amount of living labor relative to dead labor or capital, it risks eliminating the very source of value that it needs to reproduce the value of its accumulated capital. Now, what does capitalism do when now there's this big discrepancy between the two? This gets scary, folks, but I might as well mention it. Capitalism engages in the wholesale destruction of capital. Capitalism basically says, well, we're just going to destroy some of this excess capital, start all over again. Now, how do you destroy huge amounts of capital? One way is a recession or depression. You write off the value of the capital and effectively dump it into the sea. Another way to do it is literally dump it into the sea, like we do with a lot of agricultural produce, right? When there's too much production, they just dump it into the sea, even though half the world is starving, right? But another way you do it is through warfare. Like in World War II, you destroy 40% of Japan and Germany's industrial apparatus, destroy their old capital, and now, after the war, you're giving them new factories on the highest level of technology, greater efficiency to rebuild their productive apparatus. And then you get a 30-year post-war boom. That's one of the only ways that capitalism knows how to renew itself in a period of crisis, is wholesale destruction of capital. But there's a problem. The amount of capital to be destroyed this time around is so massive that it would require a dramatic decline in living standards around the world, very precipitously. And this they would not do in 2008. That's why the federal government came in and threw $12.5 trillion in the U.S. alone to prop up the financial system. But it just delays the day of reckoning. It's going to come. Now, what form that destruction of capital takes, hold your seats, we'll have to see. Hopefully we can get to a revolution before then. Okay, now, that's not, however, the worst of it. The worst of it is, capital's tendency to undermine its own conditions of reproduction is most visible in its destruction of the natural environment upon which the whole capitalist reproduction process rests. That is, since capital is self-expanding value, and value is an abstract, potentially infinite quantity, capital always acts in disregard of any finite human or natural limit. You see, there's no accumulation of monetary wealth is an infinite variable. You can never get too much of it. That's why nobody has ever met, I've never met anybody who says, hey, I got too much money, here, take some. Right? Even billionaires even don't say that. They say, I got only 2 billion, I need 4, right? Etc., right? The accumulation of abstract wealth, value, is an infinite variable, but the earth is finite, and so are human beings. Therefore, capital is driven to deplete a host of finite and limited natural resources to satisfy capitalism's werewolf hunger for self-expansion. That's Marx's phrase, werewolf hunger. And that's why we're pumping all the CO2 in the atmosphere and all the other stuff that we're pumping, methane and everything else. if it's carried out to its logical extreme, the very basis of human existence ultimately gets called into question, which is why people are now talking about a possible sixth natural extinction looming on the horizon within the next century, if this doesn't stop. So, does Marx have anywhere, I'm going to end here, does Marx have anywhere where he directly talks in more specific terms about how to organize society to break this dictatorship of abstract time, to create a society in which people who produce wealth can freely determine their time without some abstract mechanism determining it for them, that they can freely determine their activity, not have some product of that activity determining it for them. There's a lot of places where he actually has it. Chapter 1 of Capital, most elaborately in the Critique of the Gotha program, which you'll get to if you study my book, but it's Marx's fullest discussion of post-capitalist society. But I'm just going to focus on one paragraph to end here on Marx's Grundrisse, his first draft of Capital. It's in page 110 in my book, if anybody has it, but you don't have to have it in order to follow the thing. He discusses in the Grundrisse, and this is where he uses the phrase, capital is the all-dominant power of bourgeois society. Everything in the drive of logic of capital is to subject everything to the augmentation of value as an end in itself. The enrichment, that is, you increase monetary wealth not as a means to some other end, you enrich monetary accumulation and value as an end in itself. And he says, the fundamental thing that's wrong with capitalism, he says, is that in capitalism, our human relationships are not directly social. We are connected together in capitalism, fortunately not at this meeting, but generally we come together in capitalism based on not our sensuous human needs and desires. We are brought together by what? What brings us together most of the time? Exchange value. This abstraction, expressed in money. That's what brings people together. That's the social bond. All of our social bonds ultimately in capitalism increasingly become socially indirect, not direct, face-to-face, mediated by our sensuous individuality, but mediated by a third thing which is abstract, this value relation, this abstract universal labor time. So then he says in the Grundrisse, let's assume we have a new society, post-capitalist society. We've gotten rid of this. He says, now, if this assumption is made, the general character of labor would not be given to it only by exchange. Let me stop there. He says the general character of labor is made general in capitalism through the medium of exchange value. My labor is connected to your labor only insofar as it takes an abstract expression, so much exchange value of money, that we then use to buy what we need from and for each other. But our relationships therefore become increasingly socially indirect. But in assuming a new society, the general character of labor would not be given only by exchange. Its communal character would determine participation in the products beforehand. The communal character of production would from the outset make the product into a communal general one. In other words, the freely associated producers and people in the community would come together in a communal network or association and would decide amongst themselves what goods and services need to be provided given the resources that are available and the amount of time, actual amount of time, not average socially necessary amount of time, that's available on hand. And that would be worked out communally in a kind of cooperative decision-making process. Therefore, our social relations, he's suggesting, would cease to be indirectly social, but would now become directly social, okay, tangible. The exchange, he goes on, the exchange initially occurring in production, which would not be an exchange of exchange values, it would no longer be exchange values, we would not be exchanging products based on exchange values. Rather, we would exchange activities. We would exchange activities determined by communal needs and communal purposes. What's the exchange of activities? So for instance, I break my arm, I need somebody to help set my arm in a cast. I need to go to a doctor. I go to a doctor, he performs an hour of work, so to speak, to set my arm or to do whatever else he needs to do. And that counts, that hour of labor counts just as much as any other hour of actual labor. So the doctor will, I will say, okay, doc, you spend your hour fixing my arm, I will spend an hour doing something to pay back you or the community for this service, and it could be anything from cleaning your roof to washing your dishes to teaching your student dialectical philosophy, your son or daughter dialectical philosophy for 1 hour. Actual labor time instead of socially necessary labor time. He says this would be an exchange of activities, not of exchange values, and it will be determined by communal needs and communal purposes, which would include from the beginning the individual's participation in the communal world of products. So we're all directly involved in some kind of a process of determining what products are needed and which ones aren't. Because after all, a lot of the products that we absorb and consume are not needed. We don't need all this high fructose corn syrup, which is 30% of the corn crop in the United States, which is giving 10% of the U.S. population, 10% of the healthcare costs in the United States is due to type 2 diabetes produced by all this crap. We don't need that, and we can break away from that logic of it. Labor would be posited as general labor prior to exchange. The exchange of products would not in any way be the medium mediating the participation of the individual in general production. So what would be the medium that mediates the participation of individuals in general production? It would be nothing else than the very individuals themselves. So this is, you notice, there's no place here where Marx mentions the state. Nor in any of the discussions I found of Marx's discussion of a post-capitalist society, he never anywhere mentions the need for a state. I'm not saying the state might not be needed as a transitional for a certain amount of time before you can get rid of it. You can't eliminate the state overnight. But he's talking about a different way of social cooperation that organizes our time in a completely radically different way than it exists now in capitalism. All I'll say, the only other thing I'll say is, unfortunately, my argument is that there's a much deeper and more liberatory concept of a new society, a post-capitalist society in Marx than Marxists have even begun to fathom. So when Marx said at the very end of his life, referring to his two son-in-laws, if that is Marxism, I am for sure not a Marxist. And those are the two better Marxists, by the way, his son-in-laws. One was Paul Lafarge, who wrote a very nice book called The Right to Be Lazy. But he said, if that's Marxism, I am most assuredly not a Marxist. You can generalize that into most of what has passed for Marxism since, because the depth of what Marx is talking about in this passage I quoted and in dozens of others, it just got passed over. As if, well, he wouldn't have had anything to say about that. Well, you know, I think it's worth our time to, given the fact, as I said in the beginning of my talk, we're all going to be judged in the final analysis by whether we can collectively come up with a viable vision of a post-capitalist society that can animate the imagination of humanity, so we don't have one more halfway revolution or getting sucked back into capitalism after doing this or that. We're all going to be judged on how we participate, in how much we contribute to that effort. And I think Marx's work is an indispensable place to begin. And Marxist humanism as a philosophy of liberation, we see this as central to continuing Marxist humanism in the 21st century to really unravel this problem.
Thank you, Peter. Okay, now we're going to hear some comments from Sarah Mason, who, as I mentioned earlier, is a longtime activist in the LA area, starting with Occupy LA and St. Louis.
Okay. I guess, first of all, I want to be mindful that there are people in the room who haven't been reading Peter's book for the last few months, and I'll try to use, when I use quotations or terms that need defining, I will try to provide context or define those terms. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two different points, drawing on Peter's work. And I guess the first point is, why in 2014 should we re-engage the thinking of Karl Marx? And the second point is a broader question about the specific historical moment that we find ourselves in, and whether or not Marx's concepts can guide us through this present moment. So the first point, why in 2014 should we re-engage the thinking of Karl Marx? I'm going to start by quoting, reading a quotation that Peter cites in the introduction to his book. It's by Michael Polanyi. He says, "We call their work creative because it changes the world as we see it, by deepening our understanding of it. The change is irrevocable. A problem that I have once solved can no longer puzzle me. I cannot guess what I already know. Having made a discovery, I shall never see the world again as before. My eyes have become different. I have made myself into a person seeing and thinking differently. I have crossed the gap, the heuristic gap, which lies between problem and discovery." In his own words, Peter writes that Marx is not simply one of a number of important thinkers, but he's the founder of an approach to the understanding of capitalism that retains its historical relevance so long as capitalism remains in existence. Marx's body of work is one of those rare historical achievements that represent the crossing of a conceptual threshold. It marks a new philosophical moment that radically transforms all subsequent approaches to the object of investigation. So the implication here is simple, I think, which is that the magnitude of Marx's philosophical contribution is so tremendous that any attempt to understand, and more importantly, to think beyond the capitalist mode of production, cannot neglect Marx. Progressives, socialists, communists, anarchists, and others, as Peter points out in the book, often mistake the project of transcending capitalism with the project of redistributing wealth. And this book demonstrates that this was not at all at the center of Marx's conception of what a post-capitalist society would look like. Now, obviously, no one would deny that certain forms of redistribution would be necessary if we're going to build the new inside the shell of the old, but this wasn't Marx's understanding of a socialist future. He was concerned with a feature of capitalist production that distinguished it from other previous modes of production, and this is something that Peter talked a lot about, which is the rise and domination of value production. So Peter said a lot, so if I'm being repetitive, I apologize. But so as he said, people have always labored. Societies have always produced things. But whereas before, groups of producers would produce things based on their utility, like, they would produce things that they actually needed to use for the purpose of using those things. Under capitalism, people produce things because those things that they can produce can then be exchanged for money. And augmenting value, producing value, basically making money, this is what becomes the organizing force that's underpinning the social organization of labor in society as a whole. Human labor, which Marx argues is the commodity upon which the entire system relies, the linchpin of capitalist production, is generally monetized in terms of time, so the hourly wage. And like every other commodity, human labor has a dual nature. It has an exchange value, so $10 an hour, $10 for every hour, and it has a utility value, so what it is that you can actually produce or make in the period of 1 hour. Flowing from his understanding of the dual nature of commodities and also labor, Marx argues that the amount of time that's actually required to reproduce daily life is different from the amount of abstract labor time needed to reproduce and expand value under capitalism. So, I mean, I don't know if anybody read David Graeber's article on bullshit jobs, which was the title. But it basically was talking about how in, industrialized countries or deindustrialized countries, the sorts of jobs that people are doing, it's hard to know how it's actually creating value or wealth. So I have a number of friends, I graduated from college in 2010, I have a number of friends who literally their job is like social media. So they do Twitter for, Time Warner. So Marx's understanding of this dual nature of labor, what you actually need to do to reproduce a daily life, a nice life, and what you have to do in order for capital to expand, those are two totally different things. Human beings, and this underlies the way in which he imagines a post-capitalist society, that human beings would produce as freely associated agents according to their needs and their desires. And I think a sort of glimpse into what this world might look like is basically think about anything that you do outside of work voluntarily. Like if anybody's ever had a band with a group of friends, or if you've ever, read a book for pleasure. These are things that you do because they're an end in themselves. It's not, and it's based on your needs and your desires. This doesn't just include pleasurable things. Think of any time that you've cared for a sick friend. The second point of my comments has to do with the present moment. And I think this is more of a question that's directed at Peter and everyone here. So as a materialist, Marx situated his analysis based on the workplace organization and the relations that he observed at that moment. And he argues that human cooperation on a mass scale is required on the factory floor, that this environment fosters a sort of class solidarity that makes class action possible, that makes revolution possible. Over the past several decades, I think there's been an undeniable transformation in the way in which capital is organized, and then subsequently the way in which labor is organized. So you see the proliferation of these complex networks, technology, computing, automation, and to me it seems like this is eroding our ability to be social beings and to organize. So whereas in the 1990s workers might report to a physical call center to do telemarketing or to take service calls, now workers are given a cell phone and a laptop to take calls in isolation in their micro-efficiency apartment. So even as you said, industry is organized on a smaller scale. I don't want to be pessimistic, but I think these are questions that we need to ask in addition to asking what a post-capitalist society might look like, because we also need to ask what sort of formation could bring about that transformation. And more importantly, can we contribute to building it? And for me, and I think for all of us, the point of these discussions is twofold. It's first to sift through the dynamics of capitalist production as it exists in order to transcend it, while simultaneously recentering the humanist values that are at the core of this project. And I want to suggest that extracting and reasserting the core values at the center of Marx's work is desperately needed, whether it's within workplace organizing, social movements, or the incredibly daunting task of building a social formation capable of transcending capitalism. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, we're going to take a brief break. Sign the mailing list if you have